The auctioneer brought the gavel down at $315 on a humid August morning in 2007 at the Jefferson County Industrial Surplus Sale in the back lot of the U.S. Steel Fairfield Works locomotive-yard outside Birmingham, Alabama, and the broad-chested Foreman, in the stained white U.S. Steel hard hat, let out a hard chest-rattling laugh that turned every Birmingham steel mill mechanic along the chain link. Ronson Beauregard Tully, known across the Fairfield Works as Ronnie, was 54, 6 feet and 300 pounds of broad-chested mill bulk, a thick reddish mustache and short reddish beard, clipped close around a heavy weather-burned jawline, sharp pale gray eyes and a face lined by Alabama heat and open hearth glow, a tobacco bulge in his lower lip, a stained white U.S. Steel hard hat with a chipped red U.S. Steel Eagle decal pulled low. He wore a grease-stained dark navy wool slag coat with reinforced leather shoulder yokes over a dark gray heavy cotton work shirt, dark gray heavy twill mill trousers, polished black steel-toed safety boots, a thick brown belt with a brass-stamped U.S. Steel Eagle buckle, and a brass slag hammer on a leather thong at his right hip. A tobacco-juiced bandana hung from his back pocket. He had been foreman of the Fairfield Works locomotive yard for 18 years, and the surplus sale had been called for the backlot to clear equipment from a small contract recovery operator the mill had carried for 15 years until his Peterbilt was crushed against a slag-pot ladle car in 1991. The 1965 Peterbilt 351 wrecker at the back of the sale list had been on the Fairfield Works books for 16 years, and Ronnie had told the auctioneer privately the works would have hauled the Peterbilt to the basic oxygen scrap pile and dropped it for $50. The 24-year-old shop mechanic at the back of the bidder's line in the deeply faded indigo coverall had just outbid the works for $315 against Ronnie's casual $80 opening shot, and Ronnie was making sure the Birmingham steel mill men understood the joke. Heath Caldwell folded the auction slip into the inside pocket of his coverall and walked through the cinder gravel of the Fairfield Works back lot to the truck. The Peterbilt 351 was 23 feet of long-nose conventional cab, heavy iron, with a distinctive chrome bow-tie grille across the front of the long-sloped hood. The cab, faded, mill-red Peterbilt red, oxidized to chalky brick rows along the body panels and slag-bleached charcoal gray along the lower door edges. From 16 years in a steel mill backlot, the chrome Peterbilt script badge tarnished. Both round chrome side cab mirrors snapped. The Holmes 850 wrecker boom with a hand-cranked twin-drum winch listing 2 degrees right, with both cables frayed, the wooden cargo deck rotted, 3 of the 8 tires flat, the word junk spray-painted in flaking slag-gray block letters across the driver's door. The front bumper beam was creased 6 inches inward across the upper edge, where the slag-pot ladle car had crushed the front of the truck in 1991. Heath had grown up 4 miles south of where the truck had last been parked, in Fairfield. His grandfather, Avery Caldwell, was waiting at the trailer. Avery was 77, a retired U.S. Steel Fairfield Works blast furnace blower operator who had worked the OPEN-HEARTH SHOP from 1948 until the steel industry contraction in 1985-59, lean and erect with broad bony shoulders and a slight stoop, snow-white hair under a faded blue cotton newsboy cap pulled low, a thick white mustache deep, watery hazel eyes and a face lined by 40 open-hearth summers, large knotted hands with pale heat scars across the right palm. A short-stemmed briar pipe sat unlit between his teeth. He wore a faded gray U.S. steel slag coat, unbuttoned over a faded white cotton work shirt, buttoned to the throat. Faded dark blue work pants, held up with thick brown leather suspenders. Scuffed black leather steel-toed work boots, and a plain brown leather belt with a worn brass buckle stamped with the small U.S. Steel Eagle silhouette. Avery set one liver-spotted hand on the rusted bumper of the Peterbilt and stood there a long minute. He spoke quietly. He said, "Son, you bought Decatur Earnshaw's old 351. Decatur Earnshaw had run Earnshaw Industrial Recovery out of a brick shop on Valley Road in Fairfield from 1976 until the slag-pot, working the steep cinder roads between the open hearth, the rolling mill, the locomotive-yard, and the basic oxygen shop on Fairfield Works contract, pulling stuck locomotives off back grades and overturned mill supply trucks out of August thunderstorms above the Cahaba River. He had built the Holmes 850 wrecker boom himself onto the Peterbilt's rear deck in 1977 with the help of 2 welders from the Fairfield Works locomotive-yard maintenance shop on a long August weekend. He had married a Bessemer girl named Henrietta Brown in 1980, and they had a daughter, Lula, born in 1981. Decatur had died in August of 1991. He had been rigging a stuck locomotive recovery on a switching siding in the Fairfield Works locomotive yard when a runaway slag-pot ladle car rolled down the icy slag dust grade from the upper basic oxygen shop and crushed the front of his Peterbilt against the locomotive. He had been pinned between the front of his own truck and the steel side wall of the locomotive. He had died at the scene of a broken back and chest. He was 43 years old. Lula was 10. The Peterbilt had been recovered up out of the locomotive yard cinder by another wrecker out of Bessemer and parked behind the Earnshaw shop on Valley Road. Henrietta had paid the property tax for 10 years until she remarried in 2001 and moved to Atlanta. The lot was let go to the county and the inventory consigned to the U.S. Steel Fairfield Works as an industrial easement settlement. The Peterbilt sat in the back of the locomotive yard lot for 6 more years until Ronnie Tully signed off on the surplus sale. Heath had been at the auction because his grandfather had heard from a retired Fairfield open hearth worker that Decatur Earnshaw's truck was finally being sold. They winched the 351 onto Heath's gooseneck trailer. Ronnie stood at the chain link in his stained white U.S. steel hard hat, the brass slag hammer swinging from the leather thong at his right hip, and as Heath pulled out, he called across the cinder gravel that when the boy was ready to admit defeat, the works would haul the Peterbilt to the basic oxygen scrap pile for $50. Heath did not answer. Avery climbed into the cab of the trailer truck, and they drove the 8 miles east on Valley Road to Avery's brick-walled, timber-frame shop behind a small brick bungalow in the Smithfield neighborhood of Birmingham, the dead Peterbilt rocking behind them on the cracked Alabama pavement, the Holmes 850 booms pointing at the humid gray August Birmingham sky like 2 crooked fingers. The restoration would take 17 years. Nobody knew that on the drive east. Heath worked his day job at a Powell Avenue heavy truck shop and drove west on Valley Road to Avery's shop every Saturday and most Sundays. They started with the bumper beam crease, cutting out the dented section and preparing it for straightening on a chain-pulled hydraulic frame jig over 3 weekends. They pulled the Cummins NHC 250 inline-6 diesel engine out of the truck and tore it down on a stand. The bearings were salvageable, the crank true, the head needed a careful regrind. They pulled the 13-speed Road Ranger and pressed new bushings into the shift tower. The first Alabama summer went into the engine, and stories about Decatur Earnshaw. Avery told Heath about the night in 1982 when Decatur pulled a stuck Birmingham Southern SW7 switcher off a rain-flooded siding at 3 in the morning and refused payment except for a quart of chow-chow relish. He told Heath about the morning in 1986 when Decatur hauled a snapped D9 out of the cinder fill above the OPEN-HEARTH shop and let the contractor pay him in 2 cords of split hickory. He told stories about Henrietta Earnshaw's red velvet cake. The second year they sandblasted the slag-bleached frame down to clean steel. By the 5th year, the cab came off. In the 7th year, Avery slowed. He had a small heart attack in May and was at the University of Alabama Medical Center for 9 days. He came home thinner and quieter, but his hand still worked. He told Heath the truck would wait. By the 9th year, she was a roller. In the 11th year, Heath's son was born, and the work paused. By the 13th year, Avery sat more than he stood. He worked from a folding chair beside the stove, the newsboy cap pulled low, the briar pipe between his teeth, pointing at what to do next. Through all those years, Ronnie drove past the foot of Avery's brick walk on Valley Road in his U.S. Steel issue dark navy Ford F450 with the U.S. Steel Eagle decal on the side door, the stained white hard hat visible through the open driver's window. The F450 always slowed at the bottom of the walk, but never quite turned in. By the 15th year, the Peterbilt was painted. They had wet sanded and primed and laid down a deep, glossy, mill-red Peterbilt red that matched a faded snapshot Avery had of the truck from 1977, and they had masked off the driver's door with blue painter's tape around a rectangle where the flaking slag-gray junk paint still showed through, and they had left it there. Heath did not know why. He just left it. By the 16th year, the Holmes 850 booms were rebuilt with fresh aircraft-grade cables. By the 17th year, the 351 was nearly whole. They had not yet pulled the dashboard to restore the original gauge cluster. The dashboard was the last thing on the list because Avery always said, "You start with what makes the truck move, and you finish with what tells you whether she is going to keep moving." On a humid, clear morning of August the 16th of the 17th year, Heath pulled into Avery's brick shop with a fresh set of restored gauges and a small ball-peen hammer. He was 40 years old. The dark brown at his temples had gone steady silver. The small white scar across his right thumb from a slag spatter burn in 2016 was a faint line, and his hands had the thickness of a man who had spent half his life under hoods. Avery was 93. He sat on his folding wooden chair beside the shop wood stove with a heavy cotton sheet over his knees against the Alabama August heat, the faded blue cotton newsboy cap pulled low, the short-stem briar pipe between his teeth. Heath climbed into the Peterbilt cab and started to unbolt the original instrument panel from the dashboard. He worked the panel free and lifted it out. He started to wire brush the back side of the dashboard for the new restored gauge wiring, and he stopped. There was a small flat metal box bolted to the engine bay side of the dashboard with 2 stainless steel hex bolts that did not match the rest of the dashboard hardware. The box was 4 inches by 6 inches by an inch deep, the seam soldered tight, the steel face stamped with a faint Earnshaw Industrial Recovery logo and painted the same Peterbilt mill red as the original cab. Heath set down the wire brush. He took a half-inch socket and a ratchet and carefully unbolted the box from the dashboard backside. The box came free in his hand. He carried it to the workbench under the clip-on lamp and slit the soldered seam with a heated putty knife and lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in 2 layers of waxed canvas bound with brown twine, were 4 things. There was a tight roll of folded $20 bills wrapped with a piece of brown twine, 85 bills in 1980s Federal Reserve paper totaling $1,700. There was a heavy brass open-hearth worker's first day tag with a fine engraved serial number along the brass face and the words U.S. Steel, Fairfield Works / OPEN-HEARTH SHOP / 1936 stamped across the brass face above 3 small initials. There was a small black and white photograph mounted on stiff paperboard showing a small girl of about 6, in a small white cotton sundress, standing on the brick walk at the Sloss Furnaces tour entrance with the great blowing engines visible behind her, the date June 1987 written on the back in pencil. And there was a folded single sheet of plain yellowed lined paper, the creases brittle, the ink faded but legible. Heath unfolded it. The handwriting was small and careful and slanted slightly to the right. The letter was dated August the 22nd of 1991. It read, "To my Lula, the cash is for whatever a young woman needs at 18 when Birmingham cannot hold her. The brass tag is your grandfather Marcellus's. He was a first-day open hearth worker at the Fairfield Works on November 4th, 1936, and he carried that tag on his U.S. Steel issue work belt from 1936 until he retired in 1968, and he gave it to me on my 18th birthday in 1966. The photograph is of you the morning your grandfather walked you down to Sloss for the summer history tour. I am bolting these to the backside of the dashboard because the basic oxygen shop's slag-pot grade has been showing fresh ice every Friday for a month, and I do not want them lost if anything happens at the locomotive-yard this August. The truck is yours when you are old enough to drive her without breaking her. Your father, Decatur Marcellus Earnshaw, Fairfield, Alabama, August 22nd, 1991. Heath sat on the workbench. He read the letter twice. He handed it to his grandfather, and Avery held it in both hands and read it once and set it down. He said quietly, "Decatur wrote this 6 days before the slag pot came down the grade." The girl never knew. They drove east to Birmingham the next Saturday. Avery had called a retired Fairfield open hearth worker whose daughter worked at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute archives, and the daughter had given them a current address for Lula Earnshaw Brown at a brick storefront on 5th Avenue North in downtown Birmingham. They drove east on US 11 under a humid August Alabama morning and parked in front of a brick storefront with a hand-painted wooden sign above the door reading, "Earnshaw Brown Civil Rights Archives." The woman who came out of the storefront in a soft, charcoal gray wool blazer was 43 years old. She had Decatur Earnshaw's broad shoulders and her father's deep blue eyes. She wore a soft, charcoal gray wool blazer over a faded cream-colored cotton blouse, slim charcoal trousers, polished low-heel Oxford shoes, a thin silver Birmingham skyline pendant on a thin silver chain at her throat, and a thin gold wedding band on her left ring finger. Avery spoke first. He said, "Ma'am, I knew your father. He worked on his Peterbilt in my shop in 1985. My grandson here bought the 351 at the Fairfield Works surplus sale 17 years ago, and we have been restoring her ever since. And we found something bolted to the back side of her dashboard that belongs to you." Lula's face changed. She brought them into a small archives reading room, and they sat at a long maple research table, and Heath set the 4 items down one at a time. The cash first, then the brass tag, then the photograph. He saved the letter for last. Lula picked up the brass tag. She turned it slowly between her fingers and read the engraving on the brass face. She said her grandfather Marcellus had been a first-day open hearth worker at the Fairfield Works on November 4th, 1936, alongside the first integrated open hearth crew, that the family had been told the tag had been buried with him in 1972, and that she had been looking through U.S. Steel retiree estates for 30 years for it. She picked up the photograph. She held it for a long time. She read the letter twice. She did not cry until the second reading. She asked finally if she could see the truck. They drove her west to Avery's brick shop the next morning. Lula walked slowly around the Peterbilt 3 times in the open bay. She ran her hand along the chrome Peterbilt script badge, across the long sloped hood and the chrome bow tie grill. She stood at the driver's door where the flaking slag-gray junk was still masked off in blue tape. She turned to Heath and asked the price. Heath looked at his grandfather. Avery laid both hands on his knees and said, "Ma'am, the truck is yours, but not the way you mean. We are going to finish her. We are going to paint over the door so the junk is gone, and then we are going to drive her down Valley Road to Fairfield and park her at the empty brick lot where Earnshaw Industrial Recovery stood until August of 1991, and we are going to paint your father's name on the door in clean white the way he had it in 1976. The boy paid $315 at auction. The truck is his on the paper. The work is his by the doing. But the name on the door belongs to your father and your grandfather and you. They finished the Peterbilt through that autumn. Lula drove west from her Fifth Avenue storefront every other Sunday. On the morning of April the 11th of the 18th year, they rolled the 351 out of Avery's brick shop under a clear blue Alabama sky and drove her in convoy west on Valley Road to Fairfield and parked her facing the empty brick lot where Earnshaw Industrial Recovery had stood until August of 1991. Heath handed Lula a small can of deep mill red paint and a 1-inch brush. Lula climbed up on the running board and painted out the flaking slag-gray junk on the driver's door. She waited an hour. She opened a can of clean white lettering paint, and in her father's careful slant, she painted across the door in clean, clear letters, Earnshaw Industrial Recovery. Established 1976, old enough to drive her without breaking her. She stepped down. A U.S. steel-issued dark Navy Ford F450 went by on Valley Road. Ronnie Tully was driving. He slowed almost to a stop. He looked at the Peterbilt at the empty brick lot with the mill-red door and the clean white lettering. He looked at the 4 people on the gravel. He did not laugh. He drove on. The Peterbilt sits on Valley Road in Fairfield today, and the sign on the door reads, Earnshaw Industrial Recovery, established 1976. Lula runs the Civil Rights Archives on Fifth Avenue North in Birmingham. The $1,700 sits in a small lockbox at her storefront office. The 1936 U.S. Steel Open-Hearth Workers First Aid tag sits beside it. The 1987 photograph is framed on the wall above her archives desk. The letter is in a small fireproof safe in her home. She reads it once a year on the 22nd of August. If you ever see an old Peterbilt 351 parked along Valley Road in Fairfield with the words Earnshaw Industrial Recovery painted on the door in clean white, slow down, roll the window down, and listen. There is a story in that truck that a U.S. steel mill foreman would have dropped at the basic oxygen scrap pile for $50, and the work was always for the daughter. Subscribe to Iron Hook Stories for a new story every day. Thank you for watching.